Alright, so first of all, I would just like to say thank you for the overwhelming support on my last video. I got 3 likes and a subscriber from that, so I appreciate it. Second thing, if you're keeping up with the Minecraft gameplay, I did a bunch of off-camera stuff since the last video, and my house just got absolutely obliterated in the tornado moving around over there. It's okay because it was really ugly, and I'm gonna be moving anyway. But yeah. Another thing, this video is not really gonna be scripted. I mean, I just put some notes down because this is something I'm really passionate about. I'm sure this will be at least triple the length of the other video if I really go into detail, but who knows? Get there when we get there. So I guess for starters, I'm not gonna explain how I feel about it. I'm gonna explain kind of in general how Theory of Mind is executed, because this is something that I think a lot of people don't really understand. I mean, nothing against those people, but it's hard to kind of talk to anyone about this because it's such a weird concept. But like, there's so much that goes into Theory of Mind that isn't even about the brain. Because that's how mysterious it is. It's very elusive and very complex, the nature of consciousness. So I do want to just kind of cover everything, I guess, that I feel like is important. So, for starters, another thing, I'm making this mostly just because I think people should know about this stuff. I mean, I think this would be a good video if honestly you're interested in Theory of Mind. That's kind of just like a broad overview. Because it's very, it's kind of hard to get into. There's a lot of technical jargon and there's a lot of words. It's just words and words and words. When it's really not all that complicated, it's just a matter of technicality that stuff is said the way it's said. I guess, but for starters, oh my gosh, one last thing. I am making these videos as a way to kind of practice my direct communication or not my direct communication, but my verbal communication, as I find it's something I struggle with. So I figured what better way to do it than just talk about the random things that I like talking about. So finally, to understand consciousness, we first have to understand what actually we're working with. Like, we know we have experiences. Everyone is, for the most part, most likely conscious. Everyone has experiences. And everyone knows that they have experiences. However, we actually really don't know a lot about consciousness, and it's honestly probably one of the last frontiers of science because it's so unknown. So I like to separate consciousness theories into three major categories, which aren't even really about the brain, but are more about reality itself. Which are physicalism or materialism, idealism, and dualism. These can be applied to pretty much everything in theory of mind, like basically everything. Every theory you have, every theory someone else has, any idea of consciousness fits into these three categories, pretty much. There is a few exceptions, but they're not, you know, honestly, even that much different. They're just different technically. So physicalism is, I'd say, probably the most popular, simply because of neuroscience and what we know about that, and what our science says about the brain. Materialism is the leading theory, and it basically says that the material world is primary. The universe is around us, physics, and all of that is what produces consciousness. Which you could argue is very obvious, but I have looked at a lot from idealism and dualism, and it definitely has its place. I think it's that they're important, especially to consider. They may not be have the most damning evidence, but they do have very good arguments that support them wholly. It's really just kind of your preference. Whatever fits the way you think about it most is, I think, more important than what the evidence says, because any three of these, I think, have somewhat a likely possibility. They're all, I'd say, likely equally the same chance, I think. So, dualism says that consciousness is separate from the material world, but they do kind of interact in a way, and it's in these two separate things. Consciousness is kind of often considered its own separate thing in dualism and idealism. It's both considered kind of a separate thing to reality by most people. There is sub-theories and kind of deviations from this, but it is the main argument. Let me fully open. There we go. My notes are up now, so maybe I'll make a little more sense. But I would like to separate substance and property dualism, because they are, I think, different enough for me to want to separate them here. Because it kind of changes the definition. So, substance dualism, it's kind of it's the leading one, I'd say. I'd say it's the primary. and it's that the mind and holy insane. That's a thumbnail. But anyway, the mind and your physical body and the physical world are two separate entities. Now, I'm not gonna be making arguments for any particular theory here, because I could probably make a video of this duration for every single one of these theories, talking about the compelling arguments for all of them. Now, property dualism is a little less extreme, in that it says that there's one kind of physical substance, but that physical systems possess two fundamentally different types of properties. Physical properties and qualia-based properties. Now, qualia is your experience. Seeing the color red, moving, the feeling of touching something. It is your sensory experiences. Oh, I don't have a bed. It is your sensory experiences is basically what qualia is, and I will talk about it a lot in this video, so I think it's important to get that definition out of the way. Now, looking at idealism now, it suggests that consciousness is primary. I consider it the diametric view to materialism, and I think everything else kind of falls within, you know, those everything kind of falls within idealism or materialism, even dualism to some aspects. Falls in that spectrum. And there is a ton of different types of idealism, and this one is, I think it's it's really hard for a lot of people to accept, especially dogmatic materialists who are like science, science, science. Which, I mean, I guess it's me, really. It's hard to convince people like me, because its reality is basically just impossible to verify, because it suggests that the physical world we live in is you know, it derives itself from the consciousness. Not necessarily that, it's kind of, it's hard for me to explain because I don't know a particularly vast amount of information on idealism. I kind of just ignore it, respectfully. It's not something I'm particularly interested in, so it doesn't catch my attention. But it's the world and the physical matter you exist in are experienced through fundamental consciousness. It's very interesting, I think. They often suggest like a larger type of fundamental reality, in where it's kind of like an ocean of consciousness is something I hear as like an analogy, and we are all just like localized waves it's a really interesting idea, and if it if it sounds bizarre to you, I really recommend reading some good articles on it. It's very fascinating. Uh, and the arguments are very compelling. But unfortunately, I am not well versed enough in idealism to really talk about it in that matter. But I do think, personally, materialism is where I'm going to side on this one. I think it's when we're looking at consciousness, you have to understand that your first person experience and everything you experience is unverifiable. To the colors you see, to the things you think, it's all just unverifiable kind of nonsense, gibberish. There's nothing. Ooh, there's nothing that scientists can factually prove. You know, it's interesting in that when you're looking at theory of mind and stuff, you kind of just learn that we don't really know what's going on. Like, we have no idea what's going on. We really don't. Is this a firework plant? That's interesting looking. There is, oh, there is a few different types of this one. Like, once again, but sorry, this biome is just very pretty. But I do think that looking at how your first person experience is unverifiable, I think just in general, anything other than materialism is lost on me personally, in that it's just, there's no scientific way that we will ever be able to work with it. Now, dualism, on the other hand, does have more scientific prose, in a way, if you want to word it like that. More scientific prose than, for example, idealism. Not that it's foolproof, but I do think it has a much better chance in working with science. And I think it's more likely than idealism as well. I think idealism is the least likely scenario, then dualism, then materialism. Personally, I think they're all kind of about the same. Mostly idealism is just a little less, which is just my personal bias. Maybe if I knew more, perhaps I could give better insight into that, but unfortunately I don't. Now, here we're gonna get a little spicy and look at some of the more major alternatives to these, where they do not really neatly fit in, but they do kind of work in their own way, and they could be reduced to kind of physicalism or idealism or dualism, but I think that they have enough distinct voice to them that it's good to include them. First we're going to look at my personal take and it's dual aspect monism, which simply says that by the way, I turned keep inventory on because I'm bad at this game and modded Minecraft is hard. But for example, I think it's good in that it connects the brain to qualia in a way that is very seamless, but unfortunately is unverifiable. And I think, unfortunately, that aspect of theory of mind is just what has to happen. I don't think we will ever reach a point in science due to the nature of how theory of mind works where we will be able to record first-person experience and finally know the truth. It's just the unfortunate reality. I think it would be interesting and very cool to really know, but I unfortunately don't think we'll ever be able to get to that point. So, dual aspect monism is just very cleanly physical events happening in your brain are it's like two sides of the same coin. That's the perfect analogy. Heads is the physical world and the physical activity in your brain. And then tails is what it feels like to be experiencing that. That qualia, you feeling, is the processes of the brain. And it is just kind of, honestly, a different deviation of physicalism. But the main, what is it, hand it has over physicalism is that it doesn't, there's no creation. And it shifts the focus towards cognition in a way that allows us to really look at consciousness. I just said I wasn't going to make arguments for these. But I guess it's just mainly good for that. In that physicalist and materialist argue that the brain creates consciousness, whereas a monist would argue that the brain doesn't create consciousness, but it kind of just is consciousness. What the brain does doesn't make consciousness. What the brain does is consciousness. I think that's the best way I can describe it. And then neutral monism, which just says, screw you guys, reality isn't mental or physical. So, this one is really interesting. It suggests that, the brain... I'm filled up. It suggests that, the brain and matter are just kind of emerge from something else. Kind of like idealism or dualism in that way, that there's kind of something else there. But I think it does. It is interesting. I like it for that. For me, it was my introduction to monism, which led me to the pipeline to uh, the dual aspect iteration, which I think is better in that it can be interpreted much more broadly, which allows for what's the word? Connectivity, I suppose. Yeah. The next one was the first thing I had ever even considered for theory of mind, and it is panpsychism. This is really interesting, and I wish it held a little more gravity. But it basically says that everything is consciousness. Everything. From the cells in your body to the atoms that make up your computer or the food you eat is all conscious in some way. It is commonly correlated with integrated information theory, which I might touch on a little later, which basically says the more tiny consciousness you have eventually will equate to a big consciousness, which is a gross oversimplification. But for this video's sake, it is kind of just a basic understanding sort of thing. And that's really what it is. It's interesting in that it's kind of, at the very beginning, it does make sense. Because you're like, oh, you know, everything comes together to create consciousness. Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's definitely strange, but I don't think it's totally unacceptable. It's just that, honestly. I don't really have too much to say on this. I kind of wish I did, but its core argument is very simple. It doesn't mean that, like, atoms are having thoughts right now, or, you know, they just kind of have a minuscule inner glow to them, which eventually this is awesome. I guess one last thing about panpsychism, I think it is just a little, it's important to look at just for the sake of rounding things out about it, because I honestly don't even really know why I put it there, but I guess I'll mention it since it is there. There is cosmopsychism, which is a deviation of panpsychism, mainly. And it says that it kind of reverses it in that instead of small things, small experiences of atoms combining into more rich experiences, like in humans, it's kind of like idealism, where minds are smaller parts of a greater consciousness. Um, um, I think I need glass. Um, so the next thing to look at is how do I explain this? How consciousness and the physical syntax of the creation of consciousness or consciousness existence. How does how does that come into play? So this is just kind of like broad definition stuff. I'm actually just gonna rattle stuff off here because this stuff, it isn't, I think it's important, but it really isn't intensely important to totally understanding theory of mind, and is more important scientifically, which is whatever. What does this do? Diamond Smith hammer. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. First off, yeah, I definitely think I'm gonna live up here. Okay. So, back to physical causation. You have causal closure, which is my view of the brain. It basically says that every physical event has a physical cause. So for example, a neuron fires because of Freeze's physical conditions. This I talked about in my free will video. about how every system state is the result of previous system states. And then there's reductionism, basically saying that consciousness can eventually be fully explained in the most simplest, reduced terms. I also agree with this one. I think it's oh my god, I hate this guy. Die. Die. Okay. Luckily he didn't have enough room to summon people. Okay, back to what I was saying. I think, you know, brain activity is is responsible for everything, really. Give me another chest. I hate how this bar is down here. And it overlays my freaking everything. Ooh, I have glass. I could make a diamond chest. Not enough. Yeah, reductionism. I got sidetracked with the Minecraft. And then there is one that is important, which we'll get to in a second, but non-reductionism is the opposite to reductionism. Consciousness can't be reduced to all those smaller processes. Common, again, in dualistic and idealistic approaches. I was wondering, why is all this junk in here? But emergentism. This is, I think, crucial, and it is important to distinguish and talk about it. Emergentism claims that consciousness appears when simpler stuff is organized correctly. I agree with this. I definitely think, you know, actually it's kind of like the core principles of my framework that I've been developing for the last while, and I'm going to present it the Science of Consciousness conference later this year. If consciousness, is organized properly, or if neurons are organized the right way, maybe this is how we get consciousness. But it has two types, weak and strong. Weak emergentism suggests that consciousness arises from the very smallest points and can be reduced to that point. It can be reduced to the very smallest points. Whereas the strong iteration says that consciousness arises from physical systems, but it cannot be reduced to physics. Strong is more like dualism, in a way. And I think when discussing consciousness, it's important to differentiate between those. For sure important. Get out of there. Whatever. Yeah, so distinguishing those is really important. And that's mainly it. Epiphenomenalism. I'm just going to talk about it because I think it is really stupid. It claims that brain activity produces consciousness, but it doesn't actually do anything. And consciousness has no role in anything the brain does. It's just a byproduct. Kind of like the common analogy is you're on a train and the train itself is doing everything, and then consciousness is just the byproduct of, not consciousness, steam is just the byproduct of that train doing everything. That steam engine, it's going down the tracks and it's doing all this stuff, but the steam, it's, it doesn't do anything. The steam is not important to it's okay, it's just a funnel cloud right now. But it's, I think that is just a very wrong claim, honestly. To say that consciousness doesn't do anything for the brain or anything like that, I think it feels almost, I don't even know how to describe it, almost like I don't know. I don't know the word I would use for it. Quite frankly. It feels almost like you're ignoring something in a way to kind of force another outcome that you're looking for. Because I truly don't really know anyone who thinks this, but I do see it mentioned a lot due to the nature of it. If that makes sense. Chicken Jackie. So yeah, that's really just, there's physical casual closure and how consciousness is created certainly matters, but not for understanding theory of mind itself. Maybe if you really want to look deep into it, I could see it, but for most people, it's not really gonna matter. There is some more I have written down about, not written down, typed up, that talks about the nature of consciousness and what it actually is. And I think that, personally, I think that consciousness is, once again, the result of brain processes, the brain being organized the right way, causal closure, you know. But there is some more specific terms that talk about, how do I explain it? A lot of what I'm about to talk about sticks within physicalism, but it kind of disagrees on, you know, what consciousness is, even, which it's, again, it sounds really crazy to not be able to agree on, you know, what you're actually experiencing. But I think, once again, once you really look at it more, it does make some sense. Bro! Man, as long as it stays over there. Dude. Man, it is gonna tear up that landscape. It's unfortunate. So, there's biological naturalism, which just says that consciousness is biological, purely biological. You know, like, how do I even explain it? It's basically saying that the brain is the only thing sufficient for consciousness, in a way. Which isn't the exact claim that it's trying to defend, but is generally what it's looking at. Now, it's important to talk about just because AI, you know, if you're not going to talk about biology being important, then what's stopping ChatGPT from ever becoming conscious? Which I think is really interesting. Think about, I think eventually AI will become conscious. I think it will eventually have inner experience. Sorry, I was just... The jumps up to 120 FPS keep teasing me. It's so buttery smooth, and then it's not. But AI consciousness, I think, is really, really interesting. I think it's for certain possible and probably coming, if not already here. The problem is, the way I see it, consciousness kind of requires it requires specific organization, and I don't think large language models have achieved that. So I don't think wholly that large language models like ChatGPT and stuff are conscious, but I do think that AI in general has the potential to reach that point. Do I even care about identity theory? Nah. There's functionalism, which basically just says that mental states are, like consciousness and things like that, are defined by what they do. Like, you know, pain, for example, is a state that detects damage and produces distress, guides behavior, you know, things like that. And modifies the next behavior, right? If you're hurt, you're gonna say ow. And it basically just says that whatever function something's producing leads to consciousness in a way, which I think is interesting. I have to put torches down in a minute. The next I have here is computationalism, which basically says that consciousness arises from specific types of computation. Which I definitely agree with. There is, like, deviations of it. For sure. But for the most part, it basically just says that computation, you know, the correct kind, it produces consciousness. If something is performing computer-like functions in a way that supports consciousness, then, you know, that's where consciousness comes from. It's definitely the thing I agree most with. I think it makes sense that the brain, if we look at all brains, not just brains even, all types of computation, especially neuroscience supports this as well. This is what neuroscience looks at and says, hey, this is probably the most correct. I definitely do appreciate science, but I think there's other things to look at as well. At least acknowledge, maybe not wholly take a look at, but I know. Oof. I do want to talk about this one. So, illusionism. This is something that I still struggle to understand, but I do want to talk about it because I think it is really interesting. But it basically says that consciousness isn't as mysterious or as strange as we think it is. And dang, bro, that tornado tore that place up, bro. It basically says that consciousness may not be as mysterious as like we think it is, and that, you know, obviously we perceive, think, and like remember things, but our belief that, you know, experience contains intrinsic or ineffable qualia, uh, you know, just may be a function of the brain. You know, it's, you know, just rattling off that definition, it is still bizarre to me. Holy. In how it works. Oh, nah. Tornado done got my tinkering tables. Wild onion. Yeah, I just think it's really interesting. I wish I knew more about it, and I wish I really understood it, but it basically just says consciousness isn't what we think of it. And maybe that's the extent of it, you know, maybe I'm looking too far into it, but... There's a lot of, the next thing I want to look at is, like, how information itself becomes conscious. Oh, look at it go. Yeah, you can see that thing way better with the shaders off. But then when my world's ugly. Doesn't really help frame rates. Maybe I'll download some performance mods, but there's a lot of theories on how the not just our brain, but all brains and mammals, and not even just brains, but plants even, and microorganisms, how information in general becomes conscious. What constitutes and where does information become conscious? I think there's a lot of different ways you could look at this, obviously, but one of the main ones is global workspace, which basically suggests that the brain is like a theater, and then many unconscious processes and a small amount of information actually gets put on to the stage, you know, the stage of the theater. And that amount of information that gets put onto the theater is what is a part of conscious awareness, which I think is partially true, but I don't think it's all there is. I should have brought some wood with me. Um, but the uh, the deviations of this are all basically the same. But I think it's true in that not all information processing, even to something that's conscious, is there. Humans are obviously the prime example of this. There's so much we do on autopilot and in our subconscious that we don't even think about. I mean, we don't think about it at all. So I think there is neuroscience supporting this as well, but the idea of there being a type of, you know, center stage, if you would, for consciousness, I think does kind of make sense. I think that things needing to get accessed by a conscious system for it to be, you know, a full part of conscious awareness makes sense. We're getting to the point in my notes where I just was kind of writing down definitions of things. Because there's really not... There's a lot left that I didn't really talk about. But, a lot of it is very technical and very, how do I say this? It's not really, useful, for understanding how consciousness might work. And this video is really just supposed to be kind of a, you know, just an introduction to theory of mind and how the brain could possibly work. What are you doing in my boat? So I guess it's time for me to get a little philosophical, I suppose, but in my opinion, I look at it like this. I think everything that processes information is like this. I think it's conscious. I think it is. I am... You know what? Let me restart. I think there is a specific set of needs that need to be met in a system for it to be considered conscious. Oh boy. I don't think everything that processes information is conscious. For example, the AI example from earlier. I think AI could be conscious, but I don't think I don't think AI in its current state is. Mainly because I think a conscious system has to do three things. I think it has to be able to detect its environment. I think it has to be able to take the information it detects and then integrate it into its memory and things like that. And then it needs to be able to broadcast that information and have it be readily available across the rest of the system. That's a very simplified version, but I think I think things involving the way consciousness arises, or defining organizational approaches is this is what I was looking for originally, is very difficult. And I think because the nature of it is so complex, really doing anything with it forces people to kind of you know, it forces people into like a box, really, where there's not a lot of things you can really do or say, because there's so many you know, holes in every conscious argument, which is why I think moving towards a type of framework approach, which is what I've been working on, is important. Because no matter what you say, no matter what you believe, no matter what you think, it's basically impossible to really look at something and be like, yeah, I think that's conscious. Because anyone who is well versed, you know, in theory of mind is just going to be like, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And it's just kind of like, I think it is kind of defeatist. Got bones, right? That's fine, this works. But there's a lot of ways that we can go about studying consciousness and, you know, knowing about consciousness, but at the end of the day, we can't really verify anything. So I think it's important for us to look at other things that could be verified, you know, within the same realm of, you know, consciousness and or theory of mind in general. Let's see how much this goes down. 592. 199. But I do think shifting away from... Wait, why am I... What else? I'm at the point where I'm just kind of like running out of things to say. I think consciousness is very underrated. I think the brain is very underrated. I think people really ignore a lot of the beauty just of biology and nature and you know, the way the world exists. I think that trying to explain it is great. I think explaining it is an amazing thing, but I also think appreciating it just for what it is something else just is equally important. A lot of people, I think, just focus a lot on the mechanics of things and how practical something is, which does make sense. But in doing that, they often lose a lot of the, I guess, more unrealistic aspects of things. Yeah. I think people should care a little more about the nature of existence. Just the fact that things are. I'm not letting this happen again. I'll find better places for these, but yeah. I'm at the point where I think that's it. I think I've said what I wanted to say. I think the consciousness is the last frontier of human science. It's the last thing we really don't know anything about. Sure, there's the ocean, but it's just big. And there's the universe, but again, it's just big. I think those things are a matter of time. I think consciousness is... It's not just a matter of time, it's a matter of method. I mean, because the current trajectory is that we'll never know anything more about it than we already do. That's not true. That was an overstatement. Weather deflector's working. I think